When Fire Emblem Three Houses was released almost 3.5 years ago, it completely blew away expectations for both veterans and newcomers to the series. Fire Emblem had always been a great strategy combat series, but Three Houses marked a pivot in its writing that put a greater focus on making choices that ultimately change your playthrough from your friends, while also providing a great cast of characters with the proper time to get to know them. Rightfully so, expectations were set high for its follow-up, this year's new Fire Emblem Engage. Shockingly, Fire Emblem Engage steps away from those positive series changes for a more traditional Fire Emblem that focuses on its core gameplay and improves its presentation and gameplay over its writing. Fire Emblem Engage overall features a more simplified and linear story compared to Three Houses, where Three Houses offer different paths, choices, and experiences with characters. Engage opts for a single linear playthrough that in return makes it easier to follow, especially for newcomers, but at the cost of variety in its story. Fans of the approach from the last title will no doubt be disappointed by this choice. You play as Alear. She or he, depending on your preference, is a divine dragon and the child of the divine dragon monarch, Umera. After a 1,000-year slumber, you awaken with very little memory of what happened before your sleep, and unfortunately that's not the end of the bad news. The fell dragon, Sombron, is soon to be freed by their dark army, and with their return comes the destruction of your home. In order to have a fighting chance, you must use your kingdom's secret weapon, the Emblems. They are these rings that hold the spirits and powers of past Fire Emblem heroes, both those that have been localized in the West and even those that haven't yet. Overall, it's a traditionally linear story that is more like the older generation of Fire Emblem games rather than those of the most recent ones. That's not to say it didn't feature any redeeming qualities, as when the characters get the chance to shine, I should say the few times they do, Fire Emblem Engage's story does start to feel great. Unfortunately, those moments are weighed down by the focus on gameplay in combination with just a very large cast with this entry. Oddly enough, with the return of prior Fire Emblem characters, you'd think there would be a lot more time put into fleshing out or even expanding these characters' stories, especially considering some of them have technically never been in a Fire Emblem game released in the US before. Sadly, these characters solely focus on very shallow interactions, outside of Marth, who takes a more prominent role in the main story. This is all to say that Engage's story isn't bad, it's just alright and familiar, which isn't entirely a bad thing. I mean, there's been good Fire Emblem games with very similar story structures before. Likewise, when you follow up one of the more innovative entries in the series that primarily did change a lot of its story's traditions, specifically in writing, it's very easy to set your expectations in that direction, and I wouldn't say it's wrong to feel let down in that regard. Now, despite my qualms with the direction of its story, the biggest change in focus with Fire Emblem Engage is no doubt its gameplay. The big new addition both on the gameplay and writing front is the use of emblems. Again, there are these rings that hold the spirits of prior protagonists in the series. It's an interesting idea, more on the gameplay front than in its story, and a new layer in terms of combat strategy. You'll come across new emblems throughout the main story, sometimes with characters wielding them already. These emblems grant the wielder buff stats and skills, making them feel like a completely new character when in combat. Finding out which characters are better suited with which emblems, and thus which are worth increasing their bond with, is all part of the fun with this new mechanic. Unlocking a new emblem usually starts with a prologue mission that introduces that new emblem with a battle. While getting to see these characters again was fun, the conversations with them usually felt half-baked, at least when compared to the bonds you can make with the members of your party. With that said, as a combat mechanic, emblems were pretty neat. The traditional lance, axe, sword, weapon triangle is also very much still here. Sword beats axe beats lance, and lance beats sword. Whenever one weapon is used towards an ineffective counter weapon, the enemy will break, dropping their weapon and making them unable to counterattack in this current and the following turn. It's a fantastic system that places a greater emphasis on risk and reward. A well-planned attack can completely stump the enemy team, if you coordinate using the weapon triangle. However, the enemy equally has the same chance against you, and if you're playing on a harder difficulty, you may just find that happens more often than not. Of course, that completely depends if you're playing in either normal or one of the two harder, more challenging difficulties. You can either play in the more casual or normal mode. Casual has your fallen units come back to life after the battle, but the normal or classic mode is the series' staple permadeath feature. While normally permadeath would be a pretty big deal, I didn't really think so with this entry. If you're playing on an easier difficulty, you have an unlimited amount of redos for battle turns, essentially cutting a lot of the stakes in a given fight. Even on the harder difficulties, that redo is still there, just limited to 10 turns now. That's not to say that the game becomes easy at that point, but there's a lot less fear in losing a fan favorite character. Admittedly, in my case, that was also not much of a worry because there's just so many characters introduced at the start of the game, and I had barely any time to really spend time with any of them to truly care about them. Again, that's not to say that there weren't characters I liked, but before I could really start to spend time with them, I was given a new character, so unless I halted my progression a lot, I never really felt like I had the time to do it. After every battle, you'll return back to the sawmill. This is your base of operations where you can manage your parties, chat with party members, and perform a handful of side activities. At first I thought these moments were a nice change of pace from the constant battles, but over time they started to feel more like chores. Building bonds with characters, exercising, and so on could help increase my stats and even unlock new skills for me to use in battle, but with some of these only being temporary, the repeated exercises felt repetitive. The most redeeming qualities for me were the conversations with characters and the asynchronous multiplayer. The Outrealm trials let you create a map both with obstacles and enemies that other players can try to compete in, whether they're a friend or even a stranger. It's really cool and reminded me a lot of the Mario Maker sharing system, but unfortunately there isn't some sort of level scaling set in place, so depending on who makes the map, you can either be overleveled, underleveled, or just right. The Tower of Trials, on the other hand, features an asynchronous co-op or PvP mode. There's an equivalent AI battle mode too. Both are pretty useful for trying out new teams or strategies. Combat sees the biggest changes in refinement with Fire Emblem Engage, and a lot of it for the better. Sadly, I think a lot of the character building both for the protagonist and the party members suffers partially from having way too many characters and not putting a greater emphasis on conversations with the emblems. One of the more surprising and shocking updates with Fire Emblem Engage is the new visuals. Character models look so much sharper, partially thanks to the outlines around the characters. Cutscenes are unfortunately pre-rendered, so they have a bit more compression to them, but at least they run smoothly compared to how they would run if in engine. The frame rate target is still 30 FPS, but compared to Three Houses, it's a lot more consistent and smooth. The same can be said with the loading times that see a major improvement, almost double the speed of what we saw in Three Houses. In terms of resolution, in dock mode you can expect a dynamic 1080p resolution that tends to hover between 900 and 1000p. The anti-aliasing around the character models helps make the overall picture look sharper though. In portable mode, the game runs at just under 720p, but because of the higher pixel density, vibrant colors on the OLED switch, and the overall sharper effects, this was by far my favorite way to play. Like Super Mario Odyssey and Monster Hunter Rise before it, Fire Emblem Engage joins the likes of plenty of other highly optimized titles for the Switch that keep the target hardware in mind, and the end result truly shows it. Perhaps one of the coolest new additions on the audio front for the series is having a fully voiced protagonist. I don't think enough emphasis on voice acting has been placed by Nintendo, but wow, what a welcome addition, at least for me. I greatly wish games like Pokemon, Zelda, and Mario had more voice lines for the main protagonist, and having it here somewhat made it easier to feel connected to the story, despite my gripes with it. Along with the rest of the cast, I was just happy to see so much dialogue. The music is no slouch either. The orchestra pieces throughout Engage make some of the biggest fights and more serious moments all the better. There's a great emphasis on the music, so much so it's actually dynamic to the action on screen. The music will accordingly change to a louder, more epic version of the track when in battle, but to a more tranquil piece when in the traditional grid layout. Fire Emblem Engage doesn't reinvent the wheel for the series when it comes to writing or memorable bonds from prior games, but what it does do is add a fun new layer to combat and does some major presentation upgrades, at least coming from Three Houses. It's by far the best looking Fire Emblem game. Managing emblems and figuring out which emblem works best with whom is a nice challenge, while the improved character models, frame rate, loading times, and voice performances are a welcome addition. You just love to see well optimized software for Switch. Ultimately, Fire Emblem Engage is a solid new entry to the series. It's not my favorite, nor is it in my top 3, but if you're itching for a new strategy game from Nintendo that meets the usual standards set by them, then by all means Fire Emblem Engage is another good option.